my worst enemy. The flesh that's covering me brings me down to my knees.
Welcome to Sermons in the Park, a ministry exploring biblical truth from the Word of God, focusing on the truths that help us in our daily walk with Christ in every aspect of our lives. Now, here is your Reverend, Jamie McCaskill.
Hello, brothers and sisters, and welcome back to an all-new Sermons in the Park. As always, I am your Reverend Jamie McCaskill, and this is another special one here for you on a Tuesday, October the 8th. So, what I want to do today is I want to continue along with our reviews of those, we've been calling them supposed, right? Lost books of the Bible. And I want to talk about, well, I wouldn't consider it the most popular ones because we already covered those, right? The Gospel of Mary, Thomas, and Philip. But the ones that I guess you would call the second most popular, and those would be the ones that are affectionately called the Infancy Gospels. Now, these are a small group of Gospels that claim that they're telling us the story of Jesus' childhood. Because, in the Bible, in the four canonical Gospels, we don't get a lot of information about Jesus' life between his birth and his ministry. So the Infancy Gospels, they give us, a lot of stories about a preteen Jesus, as well as his family. Now, only two of those are widespread, and those being the Proto-Evangelion of James and the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, and both of which we will discuss later. Now, there were others that have been found in several different languages, but they were only found in fragments. But about the two that we will be talking about, the Infancy Gospel of Thomas and the Proto-Evangelion of James, they were both written far too late to ever be considered an authority, right? And they both contain blatant falsehoods. And by that I mean mistakes about the region as well as doctrine that contradicts with the four canonical Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. When we read these supposed Gospels, you'll see that they're full of that heresy that we've talked about several times, Gnosticism. It was these flaws that prevented them from even being considered to be part of the canon. So, in the Proto-Evangelion of James, what we see is a claim that Mary was, a temple virgin, and that she remained a virgin her whole life. We still see some of these superstitions concerning Mary today. Now, in the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, we find a young Jesus who is, let's just say temperamental. He's fickle, he's arrogant, and he's disobedient, as well as a magic user. Yes, this is part of Gnostic teachings, and it goes right along with pagan beliefs in their gods. But when you look at the Jesus that we find in the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, when you look at his character, when you look at his words, and even his actions, it's 100% incompatible with the Bible. They also attribute a lot of miracles to Jesus at this time. We'll get into those later. And these all fly right in the face of the canonical Gospels. Now, don't forget, the miracle of Cana at that wedding was the first of his signs. We see this over in John chapter 2, verse 11. It says, "In the beginning of miracles, this beginning of miracles did Jesus in Cana and Galilee, and manifested forth his glory, and his disciples believed in him. Now, even though these are called the infancy gospels, they have absolutely no connection to the four gospels. Even the early morning church recognized them for what they are: a late fictional account that creates a false Jesus. Now, as I said about other works here, the only way you could see any kind of good in these is as a historical resource, because they do show us the heresies that were found at the time, as well as the origin of a lot of these superstitions that are around today about Jesus and Mary. They are in no way comparable to the inspired Word of God. Now, let's take a closer look at each of them, okay? We're going to start off with that Proto-Evangelion of James. This is another one of those pseudepigraphical works that some will call the Book of James, which, no, this is not the same as the Epistle of James that we find in the New Testament. There are others who call it the Gospel of James, or even the Infancy Gospel of James. I actually found one that added a subtitle to it, and I'm going to read you that subtitle right now off my computer: The Birth of Mary, the Holy Mother of God, and Very Glorious Mother of Jesus Christ. Now that word right there, Proto-Evangelium, that literally means proto-gospel or precursor to the gospel. And in this case, it's telling us the story of Mary. And this one, as I said about those pseudepigraphical works, is claiming that it was written by James. And we know that James was a leader of the early church in Jerusalem. He is the same one who wrote the New Testament Epistle of James. Now, we've talked about James in the past, and we talked about him then, but Jesus and James were brothers, or half-brothers. But according to this book, the Proto-Evangelium of James, he was Jesus' stepbrother. And it claims to be giving us details about the birth of Mary, her childhood, and of course the birth of Jesus. Now, in the story that we read in the Proto-Evangelion of James, we read where Joachim, who is Mary's father, and Anna, her mother, are suffering because, they don't have any children. So they both call on God and they ask God for a child. And they promise him that if they have one, they would give that child to a priest so they can go and serve in the temple. And God hears this prayer, and he tells them that, guess what? You're going to have a child. So when Mary is born, they keep a very, very close eye on her. They make sure that she does not come into contact with certain things, unclean things. They keep her in her own personal sanctuary, which is her bedroom. They keep her there most of the time, and then when she turns 3, Mary is taken to the temple. She's given to a priest who prophesies over her and says, "The Lord has magnified thy name in all generations. In thee, on the last of the days, the Lord will manifest his redemption to the sons of Israel." And that's quoted directly from the Proto-Evangelium of James. This work, the Proto-Evangelium of James, claims that Mary lived in the temple until she was 12. And it was at this time that the priests made the call that Mary has to be married, because they said that it wasn't proper for her to live in the temple. Okay, so what did they do? They chose someone by lots. They actually cast lots, and Joseph is the one that they chose for Joseph to marry this young girl. We read that Joseph objects to this, and he says, and I'm going to read you again here, "I have children and I am an old man, and she is a young girl. I am afraid lest I become laughingstock to the sons of Israel. But the priests, they warn Joseph. They tell him that he has to submit to the will of God or he will face judgment. So, of course, he gives in because he's afraid. And then, as it always does, time passes, right? We see the angel come to Mary. He tells her that she's going to bear a child. Now, by this time, Mary's, of course, 16 years old in the Bible. And according to this book, she was a virgin. Now, the exchange between Mary and the angel is very similar to what we read in the Bible. And then 6 months later, we see Joseph find out that Mary's pregnant. He's, of course, in anguish because it's his job to make sure that she's kept safe. So he thinks, hey, I failed, right? And we see Mary explain the pregnancy to Joseph. But as many men do, Joseph is torn. Because on one hand, if, let's say, Mary had been unfaithful, well, he does not want to cover up her sin. But on the other hand, he does not want to fight against God if the baby was conceived miraculously like Mary told him. Now, of course, we know that Mary did conceive Jesus miraculously. She was a virgin when she conceived Jesus. So that part's true. Now, the Proto-Evangelion of John goes on. It goes on to say that the priests find out about this, and they accuse Joseph of a horrible sin. Because remember, Joseph was supposed to keep her pure. But they decide to administer a test, the water of ordeal of the Lord. Now, from what I've understood, this is similar to what we find in Numbers chapter 5, verses 11 to 31. We're not going to go into that. Most people take that to be a early form of an abortion, which it's not. Now, we read in this book, the Proto-Evangelium of James, that both of them are found innocent of this sin that they were being accused of. So then, just like in the Gospels, the census comes along and it says that everyone has to register in their hometown. So Joseph and Mary, they are required to travel to Joseph's hometown of Bethlehem. And in this book, in the Proto-Evangelium of James, they have to take Joseph's sons with them. You know, these sons were from an earlier marriage. Something that I found very odd here is when you read it, Joseph begins to have a debate. You know, should he register Mary as his wife or as his daughter? Either way, they're on their way when Mary, goes into labor, and they find a cave. Yes, in the Proto-Evangelium of James, it says a cave. And they go in there and they rest, and Joseph goes on to go fetch a midwife. And then we read where he finds this midwife who, for some reason, knows about Mary and knows about her situation. Don't know. And then we read the birth of Jesus. Now, in the Proto-Evangelium of James, one thing is different. Well, I should say one other thing is different, because the cave is different. The Magi, or as we know, the wise men. In the Proto-Evangelium of James, they show up in Jerusalem a lot sooner than they do in the Bible. And this causes a great commotion. And then we see Herod order the killing of the babies that are in Bethlehem. So Mary and Joseph, they escape, right, with Jesus. But John the Baptist is in danger. So John the Baptist is hidden away, and Zacharias, his father, is actually killed because he would not give up his son. Simeon, who we later see meet Jesus in the temple, is then chosen to replace Zacharias in the temple. So if you've ever wondered where the belief of Mary's perpetual virginity comes from, it was right here in the Proto-Evangelium of James. This is the first time that it was ever insisted upon. The work actually claims that Joseph married Mary, as I told you a minute ago, simply to have her legally live with him in his home, and that he had no intentions of having any form of sexual relationship with her. Now, since he already had children from a previous marriage, that means those are Jesus' brothers because they are his stepbrothers. And I actually had a Catholic talk with me about that one time. And that these stepbrothers are much older than him. This belief comes from this Gnostic gospel, the Proto-Evangelium of James. The thing is, the general consensus among biblical scholars is that this book, the Proto-Evangelium of James, was written in sometime in the mid-2nd century. That actually means that it could not have been written by the half-brother of Jesus, or as this work claims, the stepbrother. Since it is a pseudepigraphical work, then we know that it was written by someone else, someone who's claiming the name of James, because again, like I told you before, would you rather read the Gospel of James or the Gospel of some man you've never heard of before? The Proto-Evangelium of James was rejected by the church. Origen speaks on this in the 3rd century. He said that its origin is dubious. Keep this in mind as well. The Proto-Evangelium of James was condemned by church councils and church officials all throughout the years. And even though they teach perpetual virginity of Mary, which started with this book, even the Catholic Church rejects it. As I was saying, it's wrong. Now, am I saying that it's wrong to be curious about Jesus' early life? Am I saying it's wrong to be curious about the early life of Mary? No, I'm not. That is only natural, okay? But what we need to understand is that God tells us everything that we need to know in the Bible. It's perfectly acceptable for us to have, a little bit of imaginative speculation. But what's not acceptable is for us to claim that our speculation is the truth. That is what the author of the Proto-Evangelium of James has done. All right, now, the Proto-Evangelium of James is not the only one. Okay, there are other works out there. And as I've told you about the ones that we've spoken about, even like looking right here, we have the next one we're going to look at, the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. Now, as you've heard me say about the other lost books, you've heard me mention how some of them are somewhat accurate or helpful, right? They're either somewhat accurately or they're somewhat helpful. And then you have other ones that are not accurate and are not helpful. And that last one there, not accurate and not helpful, is where we find the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. You see, the 4 main Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, have always been accepted by the church ever since the beginning. They have seen it as an accurate retelling of Jesus' life story and his teachings. We still do today. That they were it's also accepted that they were written by either the disciples or people who were close to them. Matthew and John, both of those were disciples. Mark, his gospel was based on the preaching of Peter. And Luke, Luke was Paul's partner in ministry. And Luke was actually able to interview people who were eyewitnesses of the life of Jesus. And then we have this, the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. the Infancy Gospel of Thomas claims that it was written by a man named Thomas the Israelite. That's it. No more information. But I want you to notice something. He is not saying that he is Thomas the Apostle. He just says that the events that he's writing about happened in my region. That's literally what it says. Now, the Infancy Gospel of Thomas is just a group of stories that this man claims are about Jesus' childhood. Let me again state, the Infancy Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Thomas are two different works. Both of them have become very popular in recent years. In fact, I think that some of the references to the Gospel of Thomas are most likely people talking about the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. Now, scholars date this work to be from the 2nd century, which is way later than the 1st century, which is when all the 4 canonical Gospels were written. Now, as far as the information on Jesus as a child go, in the Bible, we have the Christmas story, where we read about the stable birth, the shepherds, the magi or wise men. Those are, if you want to go look at those are in Luke chapter 2, Matthew chapter 2. Luke also tells us about Jesus' dedication at the temple and his encounter with Simeon and Anna. And then Luke tells us the story from when Jesus was 12 and he got separated from Joseph and Mary, and they find him in the temple talking to the teachers. And then Luke sums it all up at the end with what we're going to go ahead and read it. Luke chapter 2, verse 52. And Jesus increased in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. Now, Mark and John tell us nothing about Jesus' childhood. The Infancy Gospel of Thomas, well, this work tells us so many stories about this point in Jesus' life. I'll tell you the miracles that this work claims Jesus performed. We're going to go over them, okay? I'm going to number them for you so you can see just how many. Number 1, in some of the later versions, it claims that Jesus brought dried fish back to life. Number 2, it says that Jesus created these clay sparrows on the Sabbath, and then he brought them to life. Number 3, he cursed a boy who then died. And then number 4, he cured a boy who died, and then the boy's parents went blind. Number 5, Jesus' friend falls off this roof, and the boy's parents, they know the character of this particular Jesus, and they accuse him of throwing their son off the roof. So Jesus raises him up from the dead so he can tell them what really happened. Number 6, Jesus heals a man who had cut off part of his foot while chopping wood. Number 7, Jesus breaks a water jar, so he decides to carry water home in his cloak. Number 8, he sows one piece of grain and receives back 100-fold in harvest. Number 9, he stretches a piece of wood. Okay, basically in this one, they cut the wood too short, so Jesus stretches this piece of wood for this bed to help Joseph make this bed for a rich person. Number 10, James gets snake bit, and Jesus heals him. Number 11, a kid dies from an illness, so Jesus resurrects him. Number 12, a man dies from an accident, so Jesus resurrects him. And that's nothing, right? In the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, we see several moments where Jesus is shown to be wiser than other people his age. Similar to, when he was talking to the teachers. Like we see in Luke chapter 2, when he's at the temple and he's talking. Now, the worst part to me, okay, this is, maybe the rest of that's the worst part to you, but to me, this is the worst part. In the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, what we see is Jesus being presented as this violent and petulant child. Okay? Like how I mentioned earlier, Jesus struck that boy dead. And then he blinded the child's parents. Do you know what happens after this? Well, we're going to talk about that, because Joseph goes to Jesus, and he reprimands him. You know what? I'm not going to just talk about that. I'm going to read it to you. Let me get that pulled up here. When Joseph saw that Jesus had done such a thing, he got angry and grabbed his ear and pulled very hard. The boy became infuriated with him and replied, "It's one thing for you to seek and not find. It's quite another for you to act this unwisely. Don't you know that I don't really belong to you? Don't make me upset." Now, bear in mind, this is not teenage Jesus. No. This is not young adult Jesus. This is Jesus when he was in his single digits. That does not point at the Jesus that we find in the Gospels. This is an insolent bully, and he's using his power just frivolously. The people in this gospel are impressed by Jesus' power. They're impressed by how clever he is, but not his kindness, okay? Because we see them afraid of Jesus. In fact, we read him showing his abilities, and it says this. I'm going to read you what it says right here. He's showing off his abilities, and we read this. No one dared to anger him for fear of being cursed and maimed for life. This is not a Jesus who honors his parents. This is not a Jesus who's growing in favor with his neighbors. This right here is a Jesus who is at odds with the Jesus that we know in the Bible. That's not even to mention how John chapter 2 tells us that Jesus' first miracle was doing what? Turning water into wine. So if that is true, then the infancy gospel of Thomas is at conflict with what the Bible says, especially in the Gospel of John. We never see Jesus perform any frivolous miracles in the Bible. You see, when you look at the miracles in the Bible, they were always there to do one thing, and that was to benefit others and point to the greater truth. The whole tone of the infancy gospel of Thomas is it's contrary to the canonical gospels. Basically, what happened with this book is very simple. And I think I talked about this before. You have very little detail, right? Especially in this case, it's about Jesus as a child. Just like with anything else, people want to know more. They want to fill in those gaps. I read where some scholars say that the infancy gospel of Thomas was trying to show Jesus, well, let's say show his deity by demonstrating his power. But I say no. I'm saying what I believe is, when I look at this, is that this particular Jesus in the infancy gospels of Thomas is he's more like a pagan god. Think about it. He's prone to throwing a temper tantrum and having mood swings. So, in my opinion, I think it's a good thing that even today modern scholars reject it, just like the early church fathers did. So, that's my thoughts on those. So I want to thank you for joining me here. I pray the Lord continues to bless and keep you, and I'll see you all soon. I love you. God bless you.
You have been listening to Sermons in the Park with Reverend Jamie McCaskill. Be sure to follow us on YouTube, BitChute, and Rumble. And as always, thank you for listening.
There's joy for the morning, sinner be still. Earth has no sorrow, heaven can't heal. Earth has no sorrow, heaven can't heal. So lay down your bed.